The title of this story is Till Death Do Us Part. When I was a child of just 3 years old, I had my first paranormal haunted object experience. My grandparents brought dolls from a trip they took for my sister and myself that were beautiful and were each in bridal attire. They had little pearls, earrings, veils, and pretty eyelashes, and satin-like dresses with white high heels. For me, this was the first time I remember seeing something like this. After all, at 3 years old, your world is filled with soft toys and building blocks, but not this. This was a doll that had a stand. This was a special gift, and the doll meant something. Night after night, I would lay in my little bed in our little home and look at the opposite wall that were shelves that were made and hung by our dad. These were to display our most valuable, important, special things for Sis and me. On my side, I had a cup with a little bear, a pillow, and other treasures that had this designation by our mama. On my shelf, my beautiful bride doll was displayed on the top with whole space to herself. She deserved this nomination. Each night I would look at her and tell her how beautiful I thought she was. I would swoon over her as she looked so majestic standing there, propped up on her little stand. She stood about 18 inches high, and at the time, that seemed to be really tall. Her presence engulfed the room for me. She was the focal point. I just now thought about it, and I can't remember if she had a name or if I named her. Odd. I named everything back then, and I remember it all. One night, when the house and its occupants were all asleep, and my sis and I were in our twin beds in our room with the shelves in front of us, I began my nightly regimen of praising my beautiful little bride doll. I was the only one awake. I could hear the stillness. Does that make sense to you? Well, it does for me. And I was aware that my sis was fast asleep in the bed beside us. Note that the shelves were hung for us, that were not in our reach. We couldn't reach anything on the shelves on purpose, and they hung there so we could keep our treasures for good and not play with them every day. I was looking at my doll and thinking about how I loved the way she looked and how I thought she was so beautiful. I can remember her, telling her all these things, saying, "I love you." Then the unexplainable happened. I was staring at her. She literally turned, looked down at me, and winked. Yes, you heard that correctly. This inanimate object moved. I watched every millisecond of this. I wasn't sleeping or woke out of a deep sleep. I was fully awake and wishing I could climb out of bed without getting in trouble for doing so. I wasn't afraid of the dark or anything, and I knew no fear. But in 7/10 of a second, that all changed. I remember laying there, not being able to move or catch my breath. My eyes were wide open, and at 3 years old, I was doing my darndest to make sense of this whole thing. I knew fear at that moment, unconventional, uncontrollable fear, and as I opened my mouth to yell for my mama, nothing came out. The tears started to roll, and I could remember gasping as I kept my eyes keen on her to make sure I didn't see anything move again, or worse, move towards me. At last, when I opened my mouth, the most blood-curdling scream emerged, and I made sure I mustered up enough energy to keep it going until someone came around and came running, and you can imagine they certainly did. My sis bolted straight up in bed, trying to understand what happened. She was 5 years old and in kindergarten, so in my mind, she was all-knowing and much more experienced in life than I was. She stared at me in wonder, From her perspective, I couldn't imagine seeing my little sister laying there screaming to the top of her lungs out in our dimly lit room. She looked at me shouting, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" Mama and Dad came running, and when I saw Mama, I jumped in her arms, still screaming, and wouldn't let go. This went on for what felt like a long time, and was so intense and horrific that my mama called my grandparents to come quickly. And they did. They were there in a flash. By this time, we all congregated in the living room, and I was able to describe what I saw. They all looked at each other, and especially my mama and grandma were very interested in the details. It was then decided by the males, my dad and grandpa, that the doll had to go. And as much as I loved her, I was in total agreement and vowed never to enter the bedroom again until she was dealt with. You guessed it, that doll was immediately taken out of the room. I remember Dad holding her with my grandpa by his side going through the living room and out the side door. I remember watching them. It was the very wee hours of the morning, and by then, my mama and my grandma fixed on the event that they hoped would settle this once and for all. They placed the doll in the garbage can on the street, and at the end of the drive, they made sure that we all saw them do this. Because I couldn't help but be still frightened, Mama sent Sis and I packing with Grandma and Grandpa, the two people in my life that I knew could protect us just as well as Mama and Dad. We kissed and hugged goodbye, and my grandma tucked us into their car, planning on what to make us for much-needed early breakfast. Sis and I were their guests for a few days. But they lived not more than 8 miles from us, so we were known to stay for days with them, as we had such a great time. And as soon, this event was something that was now a thing of the past. Or was it? When we went home, I remember the look on my mama's face. I wasn't worrying about anything, or it wasn't more of a concern. But my dad never believed in the paranormal. But what he didn't believe in, my grandma, grandpa, and my mama made up for. As the years went by, I remember that event still, like it happened yesterday. I can feel those first moments of fear, the pain that ensued after, still. And how apprehensive I became in a dimly lit room, especially my uneasiness in a room with a doll or dolls. Still. Somewhere along the line, I remember someone in the family told me that Dad checked that garbage can before he went to work later that morning. The doll was gone. And of course, they didn't tell me. And they didn't remove the doll. Could this be why Mama looked so concerned when I came home a few days later? Could a neighbor have watched the morning saga and took the doll for someone else? I shudder to think of the other things that enter the mind, and you have to admit it, you were thinking the same thing. Years later, I spoke to Mama and Grandma about it, and they were still affected and remembered it all very well. My sis never spoke of it. Probably the best thing for her to be able to forget. I was told that Dad wanted me to see a doctor because he thought something else was going on. But I didn't. My mama and my grandma knew at that moment that what I had been born into. And that was the beginning. And from this, I just knew. After all, I'm psychic, you know.